This is the Cycling Over 60 podcast, season 3, episode 16, What About Oval? And I'm your host, Tom Butler. I ended up doing an experiment that I didn't really mean to do. When I got my indoor trainer in November, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to use Zwift. For a couple of weeks, I did nothing but virtual rides. Then we ended up having a real disruption during the holidays, and I spent a couple more weeks riding Zwift. That continued on for enough time that I decided that I would only do indoor riding for 2 months. I thought it'd be interesting to see how well virtual riding did in keeping up my fitness level. One of the last outdoor rides I did was a 37-mile ride on a pretty flat route. So I decided to repeat that route and see if I could match my performance after the 2 months of virtual riding. During the 2 months, I logged about 41 hours, 447 miles, and 18,000 feet of climbing. Over the 2 months, I continued to set personal bests for power output. So my question was, could that be enough to keep me in shape for the road? When I did the 37-mile ride in November, I set a personal best for 50K. So it was a solid effort. I averaged 14.7 miles per hour with a heart rate average of 145 beats per minute. I did the ride again on January 25th. My average speed then was 14.2 miles per hour, and my average heart rate was 150 beats per minute. I see that as a significant difference, and I have no doubt that I wasn't able to keep up my fitness level with the virtual riding. The difference between 14.7 and 14.2 could be attributed to just a difference of how I would be feeling on a good day versus a bad day. However, it wasn't just the slower time. My legs were in significantly worse shape after the January ride in comparison to what I did in November. I could feel them consistently cramping up for the last 10 miles. In addition, the next night, I had some of the worst cramping I have ever had. And there was a section of my quad muscles that were very sore, like I hadn't been exercising them at all. One potential explanation for this is that I just don't ride long virtual rides. I find riding by myself on the trainer to be hard to maintain for more than a half an hour. I only had a few rides over the 2 months that were longer than an hour. I have no doubt that left me unprepared for the 37 miles that took 2.5 hours to ride. But I also think that part of it might have been that I just don't climb the same way in the virtual world as I do in real life. I do think that virtual riding for 2 months did help me keep my cardio capacity from getting destroyed. I actually felt great from that perspective on the ride in January. Even though my average heart rate was higher, I still felt like I had plenty of gas left at the end of the ride. It's just that my legs were so trashed. Here's my final conclusion. I simply have to keep doing longer rides on the road to keep up my leg strength and stamina. The trainer isn't going to maintain my leg strength. But I think if I do high-intensity interval training in Zwift and keep working to increase my FTP, the virtual training will play a role in building my cardio capacity for the road. Also, I need to experiment with ways to make longer virtual rides more appealing to me when I can't make it outside. I have been thinking a lot about having a weekly virtual group ride. Here is what I have come up with. It's helpful for me to ride in the afternoon, so I'm going to do a weekly group ride at 3 p.m. Pacific time on Thursday, and I'm starting it on February 6th. I would do the ride without rubber banding so that people who want to ride fast can do so. However, I'll personally maintain a 1 watt per kilogram pace for the ride so that those who want an easier pace can have that as well. I would love it if someone would lead out with the higher intensity group. Let me know if you're interested in that. By not rubber banding the group, it means that people can go for sprints and climbs and also race for the finish, and yet still have an easygoing ride for those who want that. And I also open up a Zoom call during the ride so that we can have some interaction. I have set the event to Cycling Over 60 Zwift Club members only. That way we can keep the atmosphere positive. I still have a lot to learn about running group events, so expect some bumps along the way. If you're on Zwift, please consider finding the Cycling Over 60 Club and joining our ride. Final note for this week, after using Stello continuous glucose monitoring for a few months, I'm going back to Freestyle Libre. I'm just really unimpressed by the function of Stello. Getting the Freestyle Libre means that I'll about double the price that I pay for CGMs, but for me, I think it's worth it. And I'm going to be making some changes, and I want a CGM that is reliable. I still would like to try Lingo, but they don't have an Android app, so for now, it only works on iPhones. Continuous glucose monitoring is something that I see as valuable, and I will continue to give updates on how that goes for me. Ever since I got back on the bike a couple of years ago, there's been something that I've wanted to investigate. 30 years ago, when I was riding a lot, my bikes were fitted with Shimano Biopace chainrings. I didn't really think about it much at the time. It was just what the bikes came with when I purchased them new. The bikes I have purchased in the last couple of years didn't come with Biopace, and it was never presented as an option. But I have been curious about what happened to non-circular chainrings. I decided to get Garren Miler to join me and take a look at what is happening in the realm of oval chainrings like Biopace. Here is what we discovered. I'm joined today by Garren Miler, the official mechanical engineer of Cycling Over 60, and as many of you know, my son-in-law. Thanks for joining me again, Garren.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
You probably have set the record. I mean, I don't think it's probably close, but you've probably set the record for the most time anybody has been on the podcast. So that's how valuable you are.
I'm glad to hear it. Yeah, and no, I love talking to you, and I love the conversations we have, because I think there's a lot of really nitty gritty, interesting things to talk about, especially from the perspective of my field of engineering. So I'm excited to talk to you today.
Here's what's going on that I want to talk to you about. Somewhere around 1989, I should probably know exactly when that was, but I purchased a Trek 1500. That bike still hangs in my garage, and you're familiar with that bike, I know.
Yeah, absolutely.
You used it for some time to ride to work.
It was actually the bike that got me into cycling. Now, it was the first bike that you loaned me to actually get me pedaling, and that was what inspired me to get my own bike, more modern bike. And it wasn't just that bike wasn't good enough, though. I did get run over by an SUV on it, but
right.
Fortunately, we've been able to restore it back to its former glory since then.
We did have to do a little work on it. So one of the big features of that when I bought it was Biopace, Shimano Biopace. And,
Right.
They were excited about it at that time and selling me on the technology. And the truth is, I really liked it. And so, when we restored it, it got restored with Biopace on it, which I'm happy about. I don't know if you feel like you rode it enough to have some opinion about it.
Absolutely. From the moment I saw the bike with Biopace and I learned what Biopace was and the oval chainring, I was like, why don't all bikes have this? This
Okay.
seems like such an awesome idea to me. And conceptually, I love it. I will say, when I rode that bike, and I haven't really ridden it recently, I certainly wasn't an experienced enough cyclist to really know the difference. All I was doing was spinning the pedals and like you said, getting to work most of the time. So for me, I didn't really notice the difference physically. But I'm also, I'm not racing the Tour de France. I'm not splitting seconds and grams and calories. I was just cruising around town. So I really would love to see if I could tell a difference today on it. But of course, that bike is so radically different from a modern bike at this point that I probably wouldn't know what was due to the oval chainring and what was due to the wildly different geometry that I'm used to.
Yeah, that's a really good point. When I got back into cycling a couple years ago, I didn't see Biopace anywhere. And I wondered whatever happened to those oval chain rings. And one of those things about when you talk about like modern bikes are very different. And I thought, well, maybe one thing is that, with all the changes that, something like Biopace is not warranted anymore. But I've been curious about it, and I'm still curious. So I thought it'd be fun to do an episode around the topic of oval chain rings and have you join me because I know that you have some perspective on why the oval chain ring would be interesting for people to think about or to use. So here's the main question. Do we no longer see oval chain rings because they're a bad idea, or is there maybe another reason?
I think you see it in cycling a lot. You see it in many sports. You see it with cars as well, where the upper echelons of the sport are really what shape the trends that trickle downwards into the amateurs and the non-professional enthusiasts. And I think that the chain ring is an awesome idea that probably didn't help people on the Tour de France as much as they hoped it would. And now the average Joe doesn't get it anymore. But I really do think that there's some merits to this. And I'd love to talk about how I think that an oval chain ring can be a huge advantage for a regular guy.
No, I think it's a really good comment. I think that there's a lot of things that you would see that professionals are using that someone like me, it's just not, I'm just not riding the same kind of bike or doing the same kind of things that they're doing. So to me, there's an interesting aspect of this, and that's that if you look back, you can find an image of a bike with an oval chain ring, and that bike came to market in 1893. I find that
Wow.
interesting because the safety bicycle, which is what we think of as the beginning of the standard bike design that we see today, it wasn't introduced until 1885. So it seems like almost immediately people started thinking about oval chain rings. My question is, even back then, as people just start riding the safety bicycle, what do you think people might have been experiencing the pedal stroke that would have been noticed in early chain drive bikes, and why they might be thinking that an oval chain ring would be good?
Well, I think to answer that question, you don't have to look any farther than the name that Shimano chose to give their oval chainring, Biopace. Bio meaning it's about the mechanics of your body. The human body obviously is made for walking and running, and that's what your legs are meant to do. And pedaling isn't exactly that, but it's close. And it's something that your legs are pretty good at, but it's not technically a natural motion. It's an adaptive thing. And so an oval chainring is a way for you to help better utilize the mechanics of your legs to do something that they're not quite meant to do. And I think that's probably the thinking that would have led people so early on to trying to adopt an oval chainring on even the earliest bikes.
So it was noticed early on, and then, in the 80s, so quite a bit down the road, Shimano did introduce Biopace. I want to acknowledge that some excellent information on the topic of non round chain rings come from writing done by Sheldon Brown. If you don't know who Sheldon Brown is, take a few minutes to pull up his Wikipedia page. He provided a ton of really good information on bicycle technology until his death in 2008. You can still find that information on his webpage, sheldonbrown.com. I'm really happy to have discovered who he was and the information that he left behind. I look forward to going through it more. Biopace is different from classic elliptical design. Now, I'm quoting Brown here. Quote, Biopace design is based on a dynamic analysis of the motion and momentum of moving cranks and legs, unlike the static geometric analysis that produce classic ellipticals. And you can find that on sheldonbrown.com/biopace.html. And I'll put that link in the show notes. I think it's interesting what he says here, and maybe Garren, if you could just break this down a little bit. So Biopace is designed on a dynamic analysis of motion and momentum of moving cranks and legs. And he contrasts that with static geometric analysis that produced classical ellipticals. So what's the difference between dynamic analysis and static geometric analysis?
So a static analysis is going to be looking at the leverage that your foot is going to have versus the pedal at any given point on the pedal stroke, but it's not going to take into consideration factors like torque or the speed of your pedal or the momentum that you're carrying through the mass of your foot and the pedal system as you go around the stroke. All it's going to look at is essentially how much force can you exert given the geometry of your leg and the geometry of your bike for a given location in the pedal stroke. And that's a great first pass, and that's going to get you a pretty decent outcome. But a dynamic analysis is going to go much deeper into actually what it's going to feel like to ride that bike. And I'd love to talk a little more about kind of what sort of linkages form when you step onto a bike and how that's going to affect your riding.
Well, let's get into that. Pedaling a bicycle is a complex process, and it involves a combination of physics principles, including torque, leverage, rotation, motion, rotational motion, friction, the laws of motion. So you think about riding a bike and you learn to ride a bike, or I learned to ride a bike. I think almost everybody learned to ride a bike, really in the absence of thinking about a combination of physics principles. But if you step back and look at it, there's a lot going on. So talk about the mechanics and the forces exerted.
I think bicycles, just to start, are something that we really take for granted because they're such marvels of physics when you actually step back and look at the fact that you're flying down the road on two wheels balanced upright. It's pretty amazing. But in particular, pedaling consists of what we in engineering call linkages. In engineering school, you'll have an entire class where you talk about the dynamics of linkages. And when you step onto a bike, what you're doing is you're forming a linkage that includes both yourself, your legs in particular, and the bike. And you're creating a system that's going to allow you to transfer power to the wheels. So when you pedal a bike, really there's two linkages that are occurring. There's the linkage between you and the bike via the bottom bracket. And then there's the linkage between the bottom bracket and the rear wheel. That's via the chainring. And you have to think of those as separate systems. You're producing an input into the bottom bracket by spinning it. And then the bottom bracket is attached to the chainring, and that's producing an output at the rear wheel via a certain gear ratio. So the linkage that exists between the chainring and the rear wheel is very simple. It's just two gears, and when you shift to a different gear, it's still just two gears, but of a different size now. And that transfer is the easy part to understand. I think we can all understand the ideas of gear ratios and how the larger ring on the front, smaller ring on the back is going to make you go faster, et cetera, right? The more complicated linkage exists between you and the bike itself. And that linkage is a question of biology as much as it is about physics. When you sit down on the seat of your bike, you're creating essentially, to simplify greatly, a 5-bar linkage. The bars of that linkage are, firstly, your thigh, which stretches from the seat to your knee. And if you're sitting on the seat, you can kind of assume that you're fixed to the seat, right? Because gravity is pushing you into it. So you have your hips are a joint and your knees are a joint, and they're connected by your thigh. Next, you have your knee connected by your lower leg to your ankle. Your ankle is the next joint in the linkage. Then you have your ankle to the attachment point on your pedal, and the pedal itself is a joint, which rotates freely on the crank arm. And then the crank arm to the bottom bracket creates the next link. And the final link is actually via the seat post of your bike, connecting the crank arm back to your butt on the seat. That's the 5-bar linkage that you create when you step onto a bike. Now, when you create a linkage, a lot of dynamics are at play. And in particular, you're going to end up with what they call dead zones. These are spots of what we call zero mechanical advantage. You can think of it like if you were to step onto your pedal and your pedal was facing straight upwards and you pushed down with your foot, you wouldn't rotate the pedal ring, right? You have no advantage to rotate it. If all you could do with your foot is move it up and down, then at the very top of the stroke, you'd have no mechanical advantage. You couldn't push down on pedal as much as you pushed on it. You would not rotate it because you're at the top of the circle, right? But if you got some momentum into that chainring, and this is actually, if you look at how train wheels on like old steam trains worked and they had those bars between the wheels, it's the same kind of principle. But if you get a lot of momentum in that, what you'll do is when you get to that dead zone, you already have a baseline velocity. So even if you're just pushing down, you're still going to just scooch past that dead zone. And all you have to do is scooch a little bit past it. And then you can push down and you're in the front side of your chainring and you'll get some power through it, right? So it's that momentum that gets you past that hump of the dead zone, right? And that's something that you need to overcome if you want to be able to move a linkage.
I want to stop you there for a second. And, because like you're visualizing this, I think, in an excellent way and doing a good job of talking about it. But I just want to illustrate that by something that I think everybody is aware of.
Yeah.
When you stop at a crosswalk or something and you are waiting for the crosswalk signal to change or the stoplight to change or whatever. Now, I always put my pedal position where I can get a lot of leverage on it to take off. If you stop that pedal position with the pedal all the way down to the bottom of the stroke, then you like have nothing to help you get started, especially if you're not clipped in. If you're not clipped in and your pedal is at the bottom of the pedal stroke, then there's no leverage that you have to create motion. And
Absolutely.
I think that's exactly what you're talking about, right?
And that's a great example of how you experience a dead zone in everyday riding. Now, when I illustrated the idea of zero mechanical advantage, I said you have to assume that your foot can only move up and down. And that's what creates those dead zones. But in reality, obviously, your foot can do a lot more than that. You can push forward at the top of your pedal stroke. You can pull up in the back if you're clipped in, right? Your legs can generate power in any number of directions, and that's due to your biology. And so when you're looking at the idea of a chain ring and you're looking at Biopace, what you're thinking about is actually the dynamics of where your foot and your leg and that whole system can create the right amount of power at the right time. And if you want to optimize that, that's the direction you're going to have to start looking is how can my legs produce as much power as possible given the limitations of where they can and can't get the most leverage given their geometry on the chain ring.
When they developed Biopace, I think this is exactly what they were thinking about, right?
Yeah, I'm sure they were.
So back in, I don't know when it started, it was, came out in the 80s sometime, but they probably started thinking about this, the design well before it came out, I'm sure. And so, they're thinking about the physics. And if you go back to this quote, they were thinking about a dynamic analysis of motion and momentum of moving cranks and legs. As you think about this, are you seeing anything from a theoretical perspective that would say what they were thinking about was wrong?
I think that they were absolutely on the right track with the Biopace chainring. I think that examining the interaction between your body and the bike as a dynamic and frankly very complex system is going to lead you in a direction of higher efficiency.
For me, there's another element here. I don't really feel that comfortable that I am doing a great job of pedaling in a circle, and hear about pedaling in a circle all the time. But man, when I've tried it, when I've tried to climb and really focus on pedaling in a circle, I don't feel like it's really a huge advantage for me. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. And of course, I'm no professional cyclist, and I don't want to talk about cycling form and what is and isn't correct, because I know that there's a million different ways that people will tell you how to ride a bike when you're racing. But I do think that to purely visualize pedaling in a circle, I think is to ignore some of the anatomical limitations that your leg system has.
It's interesting that you say that, and you're not the only one. I mean, there is an article, and it's posted on gearandgrit.com, written by Kevin Curry. It's called "The Cycling Myth That Won't Die: Pedaling Circles." Now, that to me is a pretty catchy title.
Yeah.
The cycling myth that won't die: pedaling circles. And in the post, he pointed out something that I have thought about before. This is a quote from him: "Extension muscles push against gravity all the time. Flexion muscles are only used to lift up the leg. The amount of force required to lift your entire body and keep it there will always be more than the force required to lift your leg. Why then would you expect the flexion muscles to provide the same force on the upstroke as the extension muscles do on the downstroke?" So again, what he's saying here is that when you look at like your quads that are used to provide extension, and then you compare that with the muscle groups that are flexion muscles, there's just no comparison in how they're used and how they're developed. That seems like that has to be taken into account here, but I don't hear much about that. What do you think?
I think that I couldn't have said that better myself than Kevin Curry did in that quote, because really what this highlights to me is the difference between a professional cyclist and an amateur cyclist, and why I don't think Biopace or any of these oval chain rings really caught on at the professional level is exactly because of this concept, right? Obviously, not all of the muscles in your legs are the same size. The muscle to lift your foot is going to be a lot less than the muscles used to lift your entire body. And that makes a lot of sense. Now, if you're a professional cyclist, your body is moldable, and you can certainly get on certain training machines or on bikes and you can pedal for 6 hours a day, and you can train your flexion muscles to be really, really strong to the point that you are pulling up with a tremendous amount of force because you've molded your body for that purpose, right? You've transcended that I'm just going to use my legs for walking. And now you're saying I'm going to purpose build my muscle set for this niche activity that we invented, that is cycling, right? But as an amateur, that's not what I'm doing. I'm biking to work, but most of the time I'm walking, I'm jogging, I'm maybe swimming, but I'm doing other activities. And I'm not necessarily going to get on a machine and focus on building those muscle groups that are naturally not as strong. So if you're a Tour de France rider, you're going to have these incredible muscles that are pulling up on your upstroke that you've intentionally created that way. But if you're an amateur, you're not going to have that same level of bolstering on those muscles. And it can't be expected for someone who's just riding a bike casually or who's racing at an amateur level. So when Biopace doesn't catch on at the top, it's because, frankly, they don't need it as much because they can compensate for that with really kind of outlandish training regimens that most people are never going to do.
I would love to see like some kind of investigation about this. Like take the elite cyclists that again, they're training all day long, they're climbing all day long, they're focusing on their pedal stroke like all day long as they're in training and then, using it as they're racing. I would love to see like the difference between their ability of flexion compared to the normal person's ability of flexion and then their capacity for extension compared to the normal person's ability for extension. I think it'd be possible that you would see that, like what you're saying is that they have developed their flexion muscles in a way that most people haven't come close to. And they've also, developed their extension muscles, but I just have a feeling there is a difference of their flexion muscles that even exceeds the difference of their extension muscles. That's totally a hypothetical thing, but I think it's really possible.
It certainly is hypothetical, but I think that there's a really high probability of that being the case, just given that cycling is a niche activity that you don't naturally do if you're not in that world. And so the more you do it, the more acclimated your muscles are going to become to that activity. And there will be muscular differences from, let's say, someone who trained professionally as a runner, right? Their legs are not going to have muscle in the same areas as someone who trained professionally as a cyclist. I mean, that is, just a fact.
And this kind of comes into play, as I'm getting older. There's going to be a point. Now, I think I'm still able to build muscle at, I'm coming about 62 years old. And I think I am able to build muscle, but it's not going to come on. Like if I'm cycling at, 15, 16 years old and preparing to be on the professional road circuit at that age and I start, focused on building up muscles for a pedal stroke, I'm going to build the flexion muscles a lot easier than me at my age. I'm going to be able to build those flexion muscles up. So even if you say, you can build those flexion muscles, I think if you're older and you haven't stuck with it, I think that it's going to be harder to make those changes.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly the time that someone should start asking the question, how can we compensate for this disparity in other ways? Mechanically speaking, an oval chainring is one way to do that.
What I find interesting, again, taking a look at this in preparation for this discussion, my interest in non-circular chain rings in it wasn't diminished at all. It was actually increased by me looking this. And despite the failure of Biopace, there are a lot of people who swear by non-circular chain rings. So it seems like there is some benefit that people are seeing in some situations. One of the companies that seems to me that's doing more than anybody else, or as much as anybody at least, is a company called Absolute Black. And they claim to be the only scientifically proven oval chain rings on the market. So, this is something that's very interesting to me. I mean, they are saying, look, it's been scientifically proven that this is a better design for chain rings. Yeah. And yet you still don't see them on bikes. I know you weren't talked about. No one talked to you about, well, you might consider Absolute Black adding that onto this bike.
Yeah, right.
You don't see Trek or Specialized, coming out with their own version of Absolute Black or partnering with Absolute Black. So despite this very strong claim that they make, that it's scientifically proven, then it's still not making a dent, it seems like, or a very big dent in it. I had wanted to get somebody from Absolute Black on, but they're kind of hard to get a hold of. They're European. I guess they were actually designed in England, but manufactured in France. I mean, manufactured in Germany. There's like this real European um, aspect to them, and I just wasn't finding somebody to come on. But you went out and you took a look at it. So, having looked at it, what were your thoughts about what they were saying?
So the scientific backing that they're quoting in that mantra comes from a research that was done at a university in Slovakia, where they measured the performance of the rider through many different metrics, and they used some pretty high-tech pedals to measure the exact power output that the rider was giving to the bike versus the power that was seen at the rear wheel, right? And this is the science that they're talking about. But one thing that should be pointed out is that Absolute Black's design is very distinctly different from Biopace's design. And essentially, what they did is they rotated the oval 90 degrees from where Shimano had it. So Shimano's ideology was, this is a performance thing that we're putting out. This Biopace, this is the performance element. Anyway, and obviously the 1500 that you bought back in 89 was a very high-end bike at the time. And so it had this, top of the line performance Biopace chainring, right? And so their reasoning was, if you want to maximize performance, what we want to do is maximize the effectiveness of your power stroke, which in simple terms is just the stroke in the front end of the chainring, which corresponds to the upstroke on the other side of the bike on your other foot, right? That's your power stroke, is when you're pushing down. So you think about standing up to climb a hill, when you push down and you're standing up and you can really feel the power, that's the power stroke. And so what Shimano thought was, hey, let's increase the leverage. Let's make the long part of the oval on the power stroke, and then that'll maximize performance. And so in your little stroke, you don't have as much resistance. You can just kind of pedal through it and get it out of the way, et cetera, right? But what they found doing that was actually wrong. What that was doing is that was causing knee pain, and it was causing a kind of an irregular cadence. When you think about, like I said, climbing up a hill and standing up, you have this like kind of lurching motion to your bike as you go up the hill. You're lurching a little bit at a time. And so that unevenness is going to take a momentum, and also is going to take a drain on your body, because you're going to be kind of chugging through your ride. And so the Biopace ring had that limitation. So what Absolute Black did is they rotated it the other way. They said, really what we want to do, your power stroke already has plenty of power. What we want to do is better utilize your dead zone. We want you to be able to pedal through that and have a little more leverage so that you can push the wheel a little bit better in that part of your riding. And what they found was really interesting. It didn't necessarily produce a faster ride overall. What it did produce was less energy consumption. And that's a very simple way. They measured many parameters. But in essence, less energy consumption for the same output. And it also meant less work being a physics concept, but in broad terms, less work in your legs to pedal the bike for the same outcome at the rear wheel. And this is where you kind of have to understand what I was talking about earlier with the two different linkages on the bike. There's you interacting with the bike, and then there's the bike interacting with the rear wheel. And so if you think about like when you set cruise control in your car, your engine just spits out the same amount of power constantly. It's a constant amount of power. Your RPMs are the same and you cruise, right? But on a bike, that's not what's happening. Your body is producing very different amounts of power in your power stroke, in the dead zone, at all the different points in your pedal. And that creates a non-continuous input that then needs to get rectified before it goes to the rear wheel. So if it's just a circle on either side of that secondary linkage from the crank to the rear wheel, then the kind of irregularity of your pedal strokes that's created by your physiology is going to get transferred to your rear wheel. But if you compensate with the oval chainring, the way that Absolute Black did, in the correct orientation, what you can do is you can take that uneven input that you're giving the bike as a human, and you can sort of smooth that out into a much more constant power at the rear wheel, a constant RPM. And it'll feel a lot more like you have cruise control set on your bike as you're riding. And ideally, it's not just about making more power overall, like Biopace's thoughts were. It's about better interacting with the kinetics of your own biology and creating a smoother and less painful ride for the rider, which I think is exactly what we need for someone who's not a professional, for an amateur enthusiast who just wants to ride on the weekends. And I think it's a better use of your body. It's a more efficient way to interact with your bike.
Hey everyone, I'm briefly interrupting this episode to remind you that it is simple to have your opinion shape the Cycling Over 60 podcast. Look for a link at the top of the episode description that says send me a text message. When you tap the link, a text message box will open up and you can type something that will be sent directly to me. I look forward to reading all your thoughts, ideas, and suggestions for the show. Now back to the discussion. More efficient way, and it seems to me more natural way. Again, you're using your muscles climbing stairs, you're using your muscles doing, everyday activities, lifting things up if you use proper biomechanics to lift things. It's like having you do work on the bike more in line with how you typically work.
Right. It's more ergonomic in a sense almost. You can think about like an ergonomically shaped keyboard that doesn't make your hands have to be so straight compared to your body, right?
Yeah.
And it's the same kind of concept. It's ergonomics, but for your pedal stroke.
Again, for somebody that isn't out spending, 8 hours a day training, and training in the gym and everything because they're a professional cyclist.
Right.
So I do think it's very interesting. If you go to the website, which is absoluteblack.cc, and they have a page, Why Oval, and again I'll put that link in the show notes. If you look at that, they want to make it very, very clear that they are not Shimano. They don't want to be associated with it. It's so interesting to me because despite the research that Shimano would have done, here what they're saying is that they did the opposite of what you wanted to do, and we have rectified that. And our research shows that when you rectify that mistake of Biopace, then you do see this advantage. And again, go read Why Oval if you're interested in this stuff. And, it might take a little time to really understand what they're saying if you're someone like me and not someone like Garren. But, you kind of see what they're talking about the advantages that they're seeing in their research. I want to talk about another modern player in the oval chainring market, and this is a company, I think it's pronounced Ozometric. If you go to ozometric.de, this is a German company, then you can see their concept for a elliptical bicycle chainring. Ozometric is a French make of elliptical bicycle chainrings. What I find interesting is that Chris Fromm, who's a four-time Tour de France winner and excelled in a lot of on the professional circuit. We talked earlier that this might not have made sense for professional cyclists, but here you have Chris Fromm, who has used ozometric chain rings, and obviously he's choosing them. He's got input from team technicians and his own writing, and I'm sure the testing that he did for himself, and he believed in this product. And Bradley Wiggins is another successful professional cyclist that has also used ozometric. These were designed by an engineer, Jean-Louis Talot, if I'm saying that right. I'm sorry if I slaughtered that. And he claims that this improves cycling performance. It's a non-circular shape, but it's tailored very specifically. So I'm wondering if you had a chance to look at that and have some thoughts about the shape that they have locked onto here, Garren.
I guess to use an analogy, it's kind of like thinking about, like I said earlier, ergonomics, right? If you were to grab like a square bar, it's not very ergonomic. It's kind of uncomfortable. It pokes into your hand, right? If you were to grab a round bar, Oh, that's a little more ergonomic and it doesn't hurt your hand quite so much, right? So that's like having a circular chain ring, which is, to be a little dramatic, is unnatural, right? And then you have a oval chain ring, which is generally more ergonomic. This is like taking a piece of clay and molding it straight to the palm of your hand, and then when you grab it, it's exactly shaped to your hand, right? That's kind of what this is doing for their pedal stroke. It's looking at the power that they're creating at different points of their stroke, and it's saying how can we exactly match the leverage that we're giving that particular moment of the stroke to the output, so that for an irregular input that this cyclist is giving, and that's tailored to the exact specifications of that cyclist. How can we make the rear wheel, the output on the other end of the bike, be smooth and continuous, right? So wherever they have the least power, they're going to increase the leverage, and wherever they have the most power, they're going to decrease the leverage. And what that's going to look like is at different points in your stroke, your ankle is making a different angle with your foot, and your knee is making a different angle with your ankle, and etc. And so those are going to be fundamentally different powers at different points in your stroke that an oval doesn't quite capture the nuance of, right? Because if you have an oval chainring, for example, when you're just getting into your power stroke, you're going to have the same leverage as when you're just coming out of your power stroke on the other side. And those are not analogous situations. It's actually very different kinematics up your leg. And so what this is doing is it's even further refining that sort of smoothing function that we're getting between the chainring and the rear wheel, so that you can get as close to a perfectly consistent output on the other end from an irregular input. And that's going to be, especially when you're splitting hairs at the professional level, that's going to be different for every cyclist, given their dimensions, given the length of their linkages, the length of their legs and their thighs relative to everything else, the length of their feet, and in particular, how their muscles behave and how much they've tuned particular muscles in their legs.
This kind of customization, of specifically looking at what is going on with the individual's pedal stroke and then tailoring this linkage, this part of the drive mechanism between human and bike to precisely that, man, it just seems like professional cyclists would eat that up. I would be really interested to have a conversation with someone that said, yeah, I really considered this and I tried it and I just, it felt like it was hurting me and not helping me. But I really couldn't find anything like that. But again, I'd be interested to know why people are saying, yeah, that makes no sense at all.
I mean, obviously, there's a lot of money and prestige and et cetera in the upper echelons of cycling, and they're going to do whatever they can, tooth and nail to get an advantage. So I think that if they're not doing something, if they are doing something, there is some defensible reason for that. But in this context, I can't really think of what that would be.
Yeah, yeah. I am really glad that I took this dive into this, and what you've said here has been very helpful because of the Biopace that's on the Trek, the old Trek. We have talked about it and wondered about it, so it was really fun to do this, little bit of a dive into this. I can't say that we thoroughly uncovered everything about this, obviously, but it was interesting. So here's what I'm going to do with this information. First off, there's the scientific evidence. And the truth of the matter is, I don't feel like there's much that's useful as far as the studies done for where I am as a cyclist. The studies were done to evaluate this for pros and for elite performance. They really weren't done on someone who's, in their 60s, that getting back on a bike after a long time being off a bike and kind of what my physiology is like. So I would need to see, I think, science done at that level for it really to apply to me.
Yeah, and I think that highlights another difference between professional cyclists and amateur cyclists, and that's that professional cyclists are going to be a lot more consistent person to person than amateur cyclists are going to be. If you look at them all riding in the peloton, they all are producing about the same amount of power, and they're all riding in about the same style at the same pace, and they're all have about the same capacity and capability to ride a bike. Whereas if you take a cross section of a group ride in the city with everything from, we've been on group rides together, right? and I'm in my 20s and you're in your 60s, and that's a very different cross section. So if you're doing studies on things, you're going to be looking at this really consistent group of professional cyclists, because then you can apply your findings more broadly across that group. But if you're looking at the Wednesday night group ride, that's going to be a very varied bunch. And so obviously the science is going to be geared upwards, but in reality, everyone's really different, and it's going to have a different needs and a different reason for making a setup that works for them.
And then there's the whole aspect of subjective versus objective performance. There's the scientific evidence. And again, I don't know that that really applies a lot to me. And then there's the, when I rode, I liked it. When I, way back when I used a Biopace, I liked it. And I think the aspect of whether or not I feel more comfortable if I'm riding a non circular chain ring, I think that's as important to me as, about anything. I don't want to have more knee pain. And so, there would be that aspect of it. If I started experiencing more knee pain, then, I would switch back. But at the same time, there is a role for what I would observe using it.
When you think about cycling as a lifestyle, you start to think about what it means to ride a bike every single day repeatedly over and over again. I commute to my job on my bike, right? So I spend around an hour a day on my bike. And when you're thinking about the longevity of your ability to ride your bike and of the health of your body, right? If I'm doing this every day for 40 years in my career, right? I need to start thinking about, okay, maybe even a very marginal improvement on the comfort of my knees could pay dividends by the time I hit 60, right? And it starts now for me, right? And so if I can have global chain ring, and it doesn't feel different day to day per se, but over time that marginal improvement adds up just a little bit, that could be huge for me, even if I never am on the circuit, riding the Tour de France.
It'd be very interesting to know how many pedal strokes, how many revolutions you're doing a year, because
Oh
that's,
man.
If there's even a little bit of difference when you talk about those linkages, if there's a little bit different level of exertion or level of friction or whatever in that, each pedal stroke, then that's adding up massively over 20, 30 years.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Another thing that I think about is that it's pretty hard to quantify performance gains accurately for me. There's so many things that can change from day to day, my climbing looks like or whatever, that it feels like it's going to have to be a subjective thing because there's just too many confounding variables in the picture. So I'm pretty comfortable, I think, looking at using a non-circular chain ring from a subjective perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that to understand the non-oval chain ring, it's better to look at it less from a performance perspective, but more from an efficiency perspective. You're not necessarily trying to make yourself go faster or climb that hill better, but from a lifestyle perspective, you're just looking at increasing the efficiency of how you're interacting with your bike so that you're not pushing yourself so hard to get where you're going or to go on those group rides or to go have fun with the family. And I think a lot of it too is just psychology. I mean, if you think you're going to perform better with a certain part, maybe that makes a difference for you. I know for me, for example, when I snowboard, I always ride what's called a true twin snowboard. So both ends of the snowboard are exactly the same. Because if I don't ride a true twin snowboard, I just feel in my head like something's asymmetrical and it feels wrong to me. And so if I ever switch the board around and ride the other way, it just I even though I would never know the difference on a directional twin snowboard, it's just I can just feel it in my head that it's not quite the same. I know for some people the circular nature of their chain ring, they might want that. They might want to think, it's a circle and I know what to expect and it's consistent and and I know what's going to happen.
I think that's an excellent observation because again, if I'm going out there thinking that something is benefiting me or slowing me down, you know, I'm going to feel that, regardless whether or not that's true, I'm going to feel it. We had someone one time that was talking about that you drag them down when you're drafting off of them. They were
Right.
convinced that when you're drafting off of them, you were pulling them down, and they criticized one of the people that were riding with us for slowing them down by drafting. And I'm sure as they were riding and they noticed that someone was right behind them, they were feeling that. In their mind, they were feeling that they were being pulled back.
And they were so convinced of it that I actually had to look up myself. Does it actually float someone down? Is there something I'm missing here? Because they were so convinced that's what was happening.
I mean, when they first said it, I was just kind of like, it took me a moment to really understand that they were saying that, hey, I felt you when you got behind me. I felt a drag on me when you got behind me. And I don't know. I find that absolutely fascinating. But anyhow, it's
Yeah.
just an example of what happens when you have it in your mind if something's helping or something's hurting. And I think that's one of the things that I'm going to have to go into this not knowing, is this beneficial for me or is it not? Let's just kind of see how this feels. But it's going to be a very subjective thing for me. And I have decided to give it a try. Part of the reason is I'm not going to try it on my Roubaix. I'm going to try it on the FX3, and because it's a one by. And this is one thing that I saw a lot is that non-circular chain rings can cause problems with shifting. But when you have a one by setup, you don't have to worry about shifting. So you just get that one chain ring and you're set. And so I think it makes sense for me to try that on that bike. And if you don't have a one by system, maybe it's not so interesting. But I'm going to give it a try.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see how that goes for you.
What do you think about this concept of that it could cause shifting problems?
I think there's a lot of merit to that. I mean, obviously, derailleurs are kind of precise instruments. You know how hard they are to tune and to get right, and that's on a circle where everything's consistent, right? But as soon as you introduce an irregularity to your chain ring, especially in a dynamic situation when you're pedaling, you always have the potential for the chain to jump around a little more. It might come off of the big ring, at let's say a large part of the oval, when it disconnects from that ring, and then you're still pedaling underneath it. So in that just brief moment that it, falls to the other ring, that might be just enough time to cause some issues because you're now rotating a non-circular shape below it that's inconsistent. So to me, it makes sense that it could cause shifting issues up front. I think that what you're saying is totally right, that it makes by far the most sense on a one by system. And I probably wouldn't install it on a two by system, just because there is that potential for having issues with that, and also especially for a derailleur that wasn't specifically designed for that shape.
If I love it, if I put it on the FX and I love it, which is a possibility, then I'm going to want to put it on the Roubaix. But I think I'm going to have to find someone who like knows what they're doing with oval chain rings and say, what do I do about shifting? Is there a way to adjust the front derailleur so that it's not a problem? So I think I'm going to have to get some consultation on that. Now, the bummer would be if I, love it on the FX and I talk to somebody like there's no way you can put that on the Roubaix.
Right. I'd love to see how that process goes of trying to get that to work well.
And then what do I do? Do I like go out and find the bike that it works on and sell the Roubaix, or what do I do? But
So we'll
that's
have
a
to cross the bridge
problem.
when we get there.
Yeah, we'll have to figure that out. There's one more issue here, and currently on the FX there's a 40 tooth chain ring. I think this is a really interesting aspect of this, and maybe you can describe this a little bit. But an oval chain ring is not consistent as far as the pedal stroke like a circular chain ring would be.
When they talk about, say a 40 tooth gear, we're talking about a standard size bicycle tooth. And what you're describing is the circumference of the gear, which is obviously directly correlated to its diameter. And so what you can think about, instead of thinking about the teeth count, you can think about the diameter count. And if you know how big the teeth are, you can take the diameter and you can, do some math to figure out how many teeth would correspond to going all the way around that gear given the standard tooth size. So when they say that the oval chainring is, say, a 42/38 tooth, that's to say that at the biggest point, it's equivalent to having a 42 tooth gear on, but at the smallest point, it's equivalent to having, say, a 38 tooth gear on. And that's how they measure the diameter, is in terms of how many teeth would be around the circumference.
So then that, means what do you do when you've got a 40 tooth chain ring? What do you replace that with? Absolute Black, which is the company that I'm going to go with. I'm going to go with Absolute Black.
You don't want a custom tailored one to your pedal stroke.
I am not finding out how much that costs, but I feel very confident that that's outside my
It might
price
involve
range.
a plane ride to Europe as well. So.
Yeah. So I am eliminating that as an option. But what they're saying is that a 38/42 is best for someone who currently uses a 39 or 42 chain ring.
Right.
Round chain ring, obviously. It's kind of interesting to me because what that's saying is I'm going to drop down only a little bit where my pedal stroke, I don't have as much power. So I'm only dropping down 2 teeth.
Yeah.
Where I have less power, and I'm only going up 2 teeth where I've got more power. That doesn't seem to me like a whole lot of difference.
Right. And I think that the difference is intentionally very subtle. I think if you got too crazy with that ratio, you'd probably start to feel really wobbly as you pedaled. And so I think that the subtlety is probably a very intentional outcome of this.
It seems to me like I would feel it more in a higher gear than I would feel in a lower gear. When the rear chain ring starts approaching the size of the front chain ring, it seems like I would feel that difference less.
And that's probably true. I mean, especially when you think about if you were to stand up and either sprint or climb, you're going to have that chugging motion already. And I think that when you're doing that kind of a motion, that's when you might start to notice a difference.
I actually had Biopace on 2 bikes in the past. I had it on a hardtail mountain bike that I had and the Trek 1500. And I stood up and I pedaled a lot on both those bikes. I never remember thinking I've got this like vroom, vroom, vroom feeling to it where it's,
Yeah.
I can obviously feel where the difference is. So it's going to be interesting. I've ridden a lot of miles now with a round chain ring, and it will be interesting to see how much I feel it. And I'll be reporting on it. I'll report on the process on the weekly updates.
Awesome.
When I think about 38/42, the other thing I think about is I don't think I'm going to need a new chain, a rear derailleur adjustment or something, but I don't think I'm going to need a new chain.
Off the top of my head, I really couldn't do the mental math to figure out if you need a new chain for that, because it really, I think, depends on the tensioner on your derailleur and what the range of that tensioner is to absorb extra chain. If you have a lot of sort of spring left in that you can eat up, then you might be fine. But if you're already kind of on the cusp, then it might end up getting too much slack in it. I think it really depends on the geometry of your bike, and I wouldn't know off the top of my head.
Here's going to be a fun aspect of this. I am going to get the chain ring, take the chain ring and the bike into the Trek dealer. It will be interesting if they've ever dealt with that before and kind of what their whole demeanor is. I don't think they would come out and say this was a dumb thing to do,
Right.
but it's very possible they could be like, okay, yeah, we could do that if you want us to, just kind of like subtly saying that they don't approve of this move. But I think that they will be able to say, okay, you've got some slack in your chain here that'll have to be taken up or whatever, and give some advice in that realm.
Yeah. So you've got me really excited about oval chain rings, and you make me want to run down to the store and buy one myself. But the the question I have then is, how much does one of these things set you back?
Yeah, that's a good question. They are not dirt cheap. I mean, they're going to set me back a bit. Now, there's a range of costs, and I don't know exactly what chainring. I'm going to have to reach out to them and ask them which one I need for my setup. But
Sure.
I'm expecting to pay somewhere around $80 for it.
Oh, that's actually a pretty affordable modification in the context of performance bicycling.
Well, again, I think if I buy into the notion that this is something that is going to make my pedal stroke more efficient and actually give me more longevity, reduce the chance. When I did this right across Washington, I ended up with bursitis really like killing my attempt. If I would find out, and I don't know that there's any way to find this out for sure, but if I would find out that this chainring made a big difference with me getting bursitis, then it's definitely going to be worth that money. But I am committed to giving this a try and really seeing, how it goes. So it's to me a fair enough investment to make to do something like this.
Awesome.
Garren, your comments on this were perfect. I just really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation. I know that you're going to be following this with interest, and
yeah, for sure.
And I'll be really interested to see if you bite the bullet. If I find out that I can get them on the Roubaix, if you're going to bite the bullet and do that too. But
yeah, I'm excited to find out.
All right. Well, thanks so much for the time, and talk to you later.
Yeah, talk to you later. Bye.
Bye now. I have a little bit more information to add to my discussion with Garren. I reached out to Absolute Black to find out what they would recommend concerning a chainring for my Trek FX3. Based on the exchange with them, I purchased their cyclocross 1x oval 110x4 BCD NW traction chainring. I got the 40 tooth size. The 110x4 BCD relates to the placement of the bolt holes, and the NW stands for narrow wide chain. I like the fact that it is a chainring tailored to cyclocross because I believe that means it is designed to be able to hold up in muddy conditions. Because it's a more durable chainring, it's on the heavy side, but only at 65 grams. And that's not going to be an issue at all on that bike. I called the Trek dealer about putting an oval chainring on the FX3, and they didn't scoff at it at all. I will take the bike in when I get the chainring because I want them to assess whether or not I need to do something different with the chain length. So it looks like everything is full steam ahead for seeing how this works out and if I like it or not. This last week has been cold and snowy, so I haven't been outside much. I'm getting a little nervous because, as I talked about in the update, I'm not getting a good enough workout on virtual rides. I have the 32-mile, 2,100 feet Chili Hilly coming up in a few weeks, and I really need to get out and climb up some hills. It's awesome because Chili Hilly represents the beginning of this year's cycling events, so I'm excited that it is only a few weeks away. Whether you are a few weeks away from better weather in your area or are going to have to wait longer for good riding conditions, I hope you're looking forward to what will make 2025 an awesome cycling year for you. And remember, age is just a gear change.